Hello and welcome to a Unit 2 micro lesson. This kind of gives you an idea of the interaction between your Visual Basic forms and, your Access forms, and then actually using your Visual VBA or Visual Basic items. Okay, so the very first thing I did is I pulled up a Chapter 8 challenge, and for those of you that are putting 2 and 2 together and go, wow, that makes that a lot easier because it's basically done. True. And I'm okay with that because I want to show you some stuff. So, the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up this challenge 2. It says enter a number from 1 to 10. If I put in like 30, I should say verify, and it goes entry out of range. Perfect. And if I put A and I do verify, entry not numeric. And if I put let's say 5 and I put verify, you pick the number 5. Okay. Now, what you're doing this week is some very rudimentary things that are eventually leading up to this, but I wanted to bring this up because it kind of encompasses a lot of different things and I wanted to talk about it. So, I do okay. I'm going to go to the design view of this. So here's my design view. Now, some things you'll notice that I have something that says enter a number between 1 and 10. This is a unbound text control. Now, if I click on this unbound text control, the first thing you'll note is I'm going through the properties right here. The property is called TXT input. Now, that name of that particular unbound text control is very important because it starts to mention variables and declaration of variables and things along those lines. But by virtue of calling this TXT input, we know that it's a text box. We know that it's called input, right? Very simple, TXT input. But the reason that name is important, because when you first put a text box on there, it'll probably be called like text box 1 or something very generic. But the reason we want to make sure that our naming conventions are correct is so we can reference that as we're actually going through our code so we know what's going on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how we start the code, okay, what's going on with it. So the next thing I do is I have this button called verify. Now you'll notice that this button, and I will go all the way to the very, very top, they call it CMD verify, which is command. CMD is a short for command button verify. So that gets on our naming conventions. And in our properties down here, we have where it says on click event procedure. Now you have a drop down list that usually gives you the different options to choose from. What we're going to do is we're going to do event procedure, and when I click on that little 3 ellipses, it brings up the event procedure associated with it, and this is where we get into our code. Now this is using an if-then statement, which you don't have to use yet, but it starts to describe a lot of what we're working with. And this might be something that you watch the first time, and if you don't have any Visual Basic experience or any programming experience, you might have not a clue what I'm talking about. But later on, after you watch some of the lessons or do some of the lessons and come back to this, it should make more sense. Now, you'll notice the very first thing it says, if is numeric txt input dot value. Now, you recall that the text box that we clicked was called txt input. Remember this name right here, unbound text control, that we've named specifically TXT input. The reason we've specifically named that TXT input is because I want to reference that in code. And when I call it TXT input.value, what I'm doing is I'm specifically referencing the object called TXT input, and I'm referencing the property called value, which means, hey, look to what I called TXT input, which is this bad boy right here, and get the value. Now, in this particular case, I've said, okay, I want to get the value and check to see if it's numeric. Now, that particular function is numeric. You'll have to learn some of the functions you go through, but that's determining whether or not, yes, it's numeric, no, it's not numeric. Now, I could have done something like this, because this is more along the lines of what you're looking for this particular lesson. I could have come in and I could write dim txt num test as string. Okay, well, let's do it. Yeah, let's do it as a string. Okay. Now, what I've just done there is I've declared in memory somewhere a space that will be referenced called txt num test, and I could dump data into it. So what I want to do based off the way I've done things this week is I could do txt num test equals txt input dot value. Now what that's doing is it's saying, okay, I want you to go to the text box you've called txt input. I want you to get the value and I want you to put it in txt num test. Now, when this was coded, none of this code required that variable. They just went directly to the text box and used it, which is true. I mean, you can do that, but one of the things the challenges require you to do is actually use variables. So if you were using, excuse me, I pound my fists when I'm talking. I don't know why. In this particular case, what I could do is I could say, okay, txt num test. So rather than do txt input dot value, I could do txt num test. If is numeric txt num test, then it's testing it. So then I could say if txt num test is greater than or equal to 1 and txt num test is less than or equal to 10. Notice you have this val statement right here. Every text box, when it gets information from it, is considered a non-numeric value. Now, it might be numbers, but it's saving that as, let's say, a string value, meaning that the computer doesn't really recognize it as having numerical value. So it's like you can't take the letter A times A, and it's because both of those are letters. And if a value of let's say a number is input into a text box, it looks at it like that number is similar to a letter. So the val statement lets it know that, hey, that number, convert that to a letter, that letter, which you consider to be a letter, which would be 1, you want to convert to an actual number. Okay, so it converts it from a non-numeric value to a numeric value. The reason that we check to see if it's is numeric right here beforehand is we're double checking whether or not it's an actual number before we do the conversion. And there's some nuances to that I don't want to get into because, hey, this is a section where you're learning about variables. But what then happens is it says, okay, if it's greater than or equal to 1 and less than or equal to 10, it's between 1 and 10. So it says, hey, there's my message box, and it says you pick the number, whatever the number is, okay? Awesome, and then blanks it out. Else, it says, okay, it's out of range, meaning it's a number or a letter outside of between 1 and 10, period. That's what it's telling you. However, you don't need to necessarily know about all the if-then statements right now. You don't need to necessarily know about all this, but that naming jump that lets your code or reference this particular text box is huge. Because that's where you start to get into all the nuances of, I have, let's say for instance in the calculator one, I could have more than one text box and I'm building this value. Or I'm letting the user input information and then I'm getting the value and I'm doing something with it. The text box is usually the way the user puts in values. The variable acts as a flow through for those values to be stored and then manipulated, and there's usually, let's say, a label or a message box that gives input back to the user that says, hey, this is what I did with it and these are the results. So if you look right here, it says MSG box, you pick the number and txt input value. What that's doing is everything between these quotes, it's actually just normal text. And with this ampersand right here, it's kind of combining it. I don't remember if you remember the electric company when it would say put, and it would make a whole word. The and or the ampersand symbol is putting those two values together. So the string values together. So put, right? So what's going on right here is it says you pick the number. It's taking the string, you pick the number, and it's putting whatever number you put on the end of it because it's saying txt input.value. So it's putting them together and then giving giving output back to the user says MSC box, here you go. So it's kind of a little clue in to what's going on. And then of course you've got the if statements, which I don't think you're really wrestling with that too much yet, but that's a good example of an if statement, and that's a good example of getting the information from the user. I realize that challenge 2 in chapter 8 will probably be super easy now because it's right there, but it's a good example, and maybe you might forget about it between now and then. I don't know. It really doesn't matter because I want you to get a hold of that. So I'm hoping that helps. And once again, as you're going through this section this week, make sure to start early so you can ask me questions. Text them to me, email them to me. However, you get that information to me so I can field these and work with it. Thank you very much for your time. I hope this week is as productive as last week.